Welcome to a story that whispers secrets long buried beneath polished Victorian walls. At first glance, the portraits of Boston's elite seem perfect. Smiling families, grand parlor rooms, children in fine clothes. But one photograph hides something darker, something that the casual eye cannot see. A child seated on the floor, her gaze averted, her tiny body dressed in worn and patched clothing, conceals a story of betrayal, greed, and an unspeakable tragedy that shaped a family dynasty. As historian Daniel Harper uncovers the forgotten documents of the Worthington family, he realizes that appearances deceive, and the cheerful facade hides horrors that have remained silent for over a century. Each letter, photograph, and diary page whispers a truth that someone had fought to erase. What Daniel finds will challenge everything he knows about history, wealth, and human cruelty. Before we go deeper, understand this. This story isn't for everyone. If you're still here, you're one of the few who can face what America buried. Subscribe now, and tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? And would you dare hear this story from your own backyard? Chapter 1. The Forgotten Trunk. Daniel Harper had always believed that history spoke only in dates, names, and records neatly filed away in archives. But the day he wandered into the Petton estate sale, he realized that history sometimes whispered in shadows, and some secrets clawed their way out of the past. The mansion on Beacon Hill loomed over the streets like a cathedral of forgotten wealth, its windows gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Inside, the air smelled of varnish, dust, and the faint tang of old paper. Antique dealers and curiosity seekers crowded the grand rooms, haggling over silver tea sets, mahogany desks, and oil paintings that had adorned walls for over a century. Daniel drifted away from the bustle, climbing the narrow staircase to the third floor. These rooms had once been servants' quarters, small, dimly lit, and overlooked by the buyers downstairs. Here the furniture was plain, the beds narrow, and the corners thick with cobwebs. In one corner, half hidden beneath a tattered rug, he spotted a wooden trunk. Its brass hinges were tarnished, and the lid was slightly ajar as if inviting him. Carefully, he lifted it, the lid creaking like a groan of protest. Inside, he found stacks of photographs, letters, and fragile documents dating back to the 1890s. His fingers trembled as he sifted through them, each image a window into Boston's gilded age. There were formal portraits of stern ancestors, snapshots of garden parties, children in sailor suits, and women in elaborate dresses with puffed sleeves. But one photograph stopped him cold. It was a large family portrait, the kind designed to display wealth and perfect domesticity. The father sat in a carved wooden chair, confident in an expensive suit. Beside him, the mother stood in a gown with intricate embroidery, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. 3 children posed around them, 2 boys in matching velvet suits, perhaps 10 and 12, and a girl of about 8 in a delicate white dress. Yet it was the youngest child, seated on the floor at her mother's feet, that arrested Daniel's attention. The girl's head was slightly bowed, her thin face partly shadowed. Unlike her siblings, she did not look at the camera. Her dress, worn and patched, hinted at neglect, and her shoes were cracked and several sizes too large. Daniel turned the photograph over. Faded ink read, "The Worthington Family, Christmas, 1898. The name was familiar, Boston's elite, a shipping dynasty erased from memory. But it was the child who seemed most erased of all. He purchased the trunk for $20, a bargain the dealer accepted without hesitation. That evening, Daniel spread the photographs across his dining table, studying them under the harsh light of his lamp. The child's gaze, the subtle shadows, the threadbare dress, it all suggested a story someone had desperately tried to hide. Daniel's pulse quickened. This was more than a family portrait. This was a doorway into secrets, horrors, and lies buried for decades. History had whispered to him, and he had no choice but to listen. CTA. If you dare to uncover secrets hidden in the shadows of Boston's past, subscribe now and join us on this journey into the forgotten and forbidden. Next we discover why the youngest child was deliberately hidden from the world, and what dark truths the Worthington family tried to erase. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Attic. The next morning, Daniel Harper returned to the trunk. a sense of unease trailing him up the narrow stairs to his South End apartment. Dust floated in the sunbeams that cut through the blinds, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and varnish. The Worthington family portrait lay face up on the table, as if waiting for him, demanding attention. He traced the lines of the youngest child's bowed head, the folds of her worn dress, the cracked leather of her too large shoes. Something about her presence, silent, invisible, yet profoundly felt, made his pulse quicken. Daniel sifted through the letters in the trunk. Most were mundane notes. Invitations to society events, orders for shipments, polite thank-you cards. But one letter, written in faint, trembling ink, made him pause. It spoke of a child kept apart, unseen, and to be disciplined silently. No name was mentioned, but the words carried weight, a quiet cruelty hidden beneath the polite tone. He felt the cold certainty that this was her, the child in the photograph. The apartment grew still around him. The faint scratch of his pen seemed deafening. Shadows pooled near the corners of the room, and Daniel swore that in the reflection of his magnifying glass he saw a small figure standing just behind him. He spun around. Nothing. Only the lingering chill of the morning. He compared the letters to public records, noting gaps where the youngest child should have appeared. Birth announcements, school registries, even baptism records. There was nothing. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase her existence. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. It was as though the child had been deliberately removed not only from the family's memory, but from history itself. Determined to understand, he catalogued the photographs chronologically, observing subtle changes over time. The mother's hand had always rested on the older children. The youngest child's posture remained bowed, almost invisible. Even in the happiest images, a shadow lingered over her. It was in the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes never met the camera. The more Daniel studied, the more he understood that someone had trained her to vanish, to become nothing in plain sight. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the past pressing down. A historian's curiosity was a dangerous thing when it brushed against secrets buried by wealth, pride, and shame. And Daniel had just opened a trunk that promised answers, answers someone had spent decades trying to conceal. As evening fell, the lamp cast long, trembling shadows across the room. Daniel stared at the photograph once more, feeling a connection to a child who had lived unseen, uncelebrated, and tragically alone. He knew that uncovering her story would reveal more than family secrets. It would expose the darkness at the heart of Boston's Gilded Age, a darkness no historian had yet dared to illuminate. Next, we discover the hidden conditions the child endured and the shocking truth about why the Worthington family went to such lengths to erase her existence. Chapter 3. The Vanished Diaries. The following day, Daniel Harper found himself walking the narrow cobbled streets of Boston, the air crisp with early spring chill. He had heard of a private collection tucked beneath the city, a repository of diaries and letters from families long forgotten, many sealed away for decades. His curiosity, now more urgent than ever, drove him forward. Each step echoed, mingling with the distant rumble of a horse-drawn carriage and the faint hum of the city's awakening. Inside the dim, wood-paneled library, the scent of leather-bound volumes and musty pages enveloped him. Rows of shelves climbed to the ceiling, ladders creaking as historians and archivists moved carefully, as if the air itself might disturb the secrets held within. Daniel approached a small section labeled Private Writings, 1890 to 1905. Among them, a leather-bound diary, unmarked by name, seemed to hum with silent urgency. As he opened it, he was greeted by cramped, hurried handwriting, almost trembling in its intensity. The words were fragmented, desperate, describing a child kept hidden, never allowed among others, punished for drawing attention, and the world must never know. Daniel's pulse quickened as he turned each page. The diary painted a portrait of neglect and secrecy, a child forced into the shadows while her siblings flourished in the family's public image. The more he read, the more Daniel felt the weight of the past pressing on him. Each line hinted at carefully constructed lies, at wealth wielded as a weapon, and at the suffocating isolation imposed on the youngest Worthington child. Here, in these fragile pages, she had found a voice, even if the world had refused to listen. He closed the diary gently, his fingers trembling. For the first time, Daniel realized that this child's story was not simply about poverty or misfortune. It was a tale of erasure, orchestrated by a family determined to protect their reputation at all costs. Every photograph, every letter, every fleeting record in the archives had been curated to hide her existence, leaving only shadows for a curious historian to piece together. Daniel felt a shiver creep up his spine. He was no longer merely observing history. He was uncovering a secret someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. And the sense of urgency in the diary suggested that this was more than a forgotten family drama. It was a warning. He lingered in the library long after the last visitors had gone, the dim light casting elongated shadows across the shelves. Somewhere in the silence, he thought he heard the faint echo of a child's laughter, fragile and brittle, like glass. It was gone as quickly as it came, but Daniel could not shake the feeling that she was watching him, urging him to continue. Next, we discover the dark force behind the child's erasure, and a shocking revelation hidden in the walls of the mansion itself. Disclaimer: this story is pure fiction, crafted for entertainment. Names, events, and characters are imaginary. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Mansion. That evening, Daniel returned to the Peton mansion, drawn by an almost magnetic curiosity. The sun had dipped behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the ornate facade. The mansion felt different at dusk, less a home, more a vessel for memories unwilling to remain buried. He climbed the creaking stairs to the third floor, where the servants' quarters had once confined those unseen by polite society. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the faint scent of decay and old wood filled his nostrils. Each step seemed to awaken whispers, carried by the wind slipping through cracked windows. The trunk lay open on the floor, photographs fanned across the rug. Daniel's eyes, however, kept returning to the youngest Worthington child in the portrait, her bowed head, the worn dress, the shoes that were far too large. She seemed to exist between worlds, visible only to those willing to truly look. As he explored, Daniel found an old trunk tucked into the attic's corner, forgotten and half-covered in cobwebs. Inside were toys, cracked porcelain dolls, and children's clothing, faded and moth-eaten. Among the garments, a pair of tiny shoes caught his attention, shoes that matched the photograph perfectly. The realization struck him cold. Someone had stored these items carefully, as if preserving a fragment of a child erased from family memory. The attic was silent, except for the soft creak of floorboards beneath him. Daniel paused, sensing a presence behind the shadows, fleeting and intangible. A chill brushed his neck, and for a brief moment he thought he saw a small figure in the corner watching him. But when he blinked, nothing remained. Only the echo of a laughter that was not quite human, brittle and hollow, like glass breaking softly in the distance. Daniel's pulse quickened. The mansion itself seemed alive, a silent witness to the hidden life of a child no one wanted to remember. Each object he touched carried a story. The dolls were cracked but carefully placed, the clothes folded with precision, the shoes lined up neatly as if awaiting someone who would never return. It was as if the house itself had been tasked with remembering what the family had tried to erase. He leaned against a dusty beam, breathing heavily. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, curling around him, whispering secrets he was only beginning to understand. The mansion had held this child in its walls, hidden from the world, and yet it had preserved her presence through decades of neglect and silence. Daniel realized the journey ahead would be treacherous. The child's story was intertwined with the mansion, her life and suffering encoded into the very structure of the place. To uncover the truth, he would have to navigate not just old letters and photographs, but the lingering echoes of those who had lived and died in these walls. Next we discover the chilling conditions in which the child was kept, and the startling revelation that connects the mansion itself to the family's darkest secrets. Chapter 5. The Silent Witness. Daniel Harper returned to his apartment, the evening air still heavy with the scent of spring rain. The Worthington photograph sat before him on the dining table, the youngest child's bowed head staring back as if she knew he was uncovering the truth. He leaned in, magnifying glass in hand, tracing the subtle shadows across her face, the folds of her threadbare dress, the cracked leather of her too large shoes. Each detail whispered of neglect, of a life deliberately unseen. He spread out letters, journals, and documents from the trunk, piecing together the fragments of a hidden existence. The older children appeared in public announcements, boarding school records, and society pages, but there was no trace of the youngest child beyond the fading photograph. It was as if someone had meticulously erased her from the records, leaving only hints for the most persistent historian to discover. Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by a letter slipped among the photographs, its edges brittle with age. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. She must remain unseen. She is our secret. Should anyone ask, she never existed. A chill ran down his spine. The family had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure she was forgotten. Their wealth and influence had built an invisible cage around her, and the mansion itself had been her prison. He closed his eyes, imagining her life. Perhaps she had spent her days in dim rooms, forbidden from playing with her siblings, forced to remain silent while the rest of the household laughed and celebrated. The thought tightened something in Daniel's chest. This was not simply neglect. It was intentional erasure, a deliberate attempt to hide a human being behind the illusion of propriety and wealth. He leaned back in his chair, considering the weight of what he had uncovered. The photograph, the letters, the escaus. It had toys in the mansion's attic. They were all silent witnesses to her suffering. And yet she had left traces, hidden in plain sight for anyone willing to look closely. Daniel understood then that uncovering her story was more than a historical exercise. It was an act of justice, a chance to give voice to someone who had been rendered invisible for decades. The apartment grew colder as the evening deepened, shadows stretching across the walls like fingers. Daniel felt a presence, faint but undeniable, as though the child herself were watching him, urging him to continue. He shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization that some stories are heavier than any historian anticipates, and some truths are buried in shadows for a reason. He returned to the photograph, tracing the curve of the child's tiny shoulders with his eyes. She was still there, waiting for someone to acknowledge her, and Daniel had no choice but to follow the trail she had left, to confront the darkness that had hidden her for so long. Next we discover the shocking revelation of the child's daily life and the cruel mechanisms her family used to keep her hidden, and the first hints of the person who might have overseen her suffering. Chapter 6. Letters in the Dark. The next evening, Daniel Harper returned to his apartment, the city streets damp from an earlier drizzle. He lit a single lamp, its soft glow casting long shadows across the scattered letters, photographs, and documents from the trunk. Tonight, he felt a growing urgency, a pull toward the parts of the story that had been deliberately hidden, the letters that carried whispers no one else had dared read. He began sorting the correspondence chronologically, the pages brittle beneath his fingers. Most of the letters were mundane, thank you notes for social visits, polite acknowledgements of shipments, and invitations to grand dinners. But one envelope, small and unmarked, had been tucked between others as if deliberately concealed. He opened it carefully, the fragile paper almost disintegrating in his hands. The words inside were written in a precise, controlled script, yet beneath the surface lingered a tension that made Daniel's chest tighten. The child must remain unseen. She is not to interact with the others. Every detail of her existence is to be hidden. Should anyone inquire, deny her entirely. Daniel's pulse quickened. The youngest Worthington child was not only neglected, she had been deliberately erased, as if her existence threatened the family's carefully curated image. The letters described her daily life in chilling detail, restricted to small rooms, her meals separate from the rest of the household, her clothing threadbare, while the other children wore the finest fabrics. Any attempt to draw attention to herself was met with harsh reprimands. The family had weaponized wealth and influence to construct an invisible cage around her. He spread the letters across the table, each one adding pieces to a story that had remained buried for over a century. The child had lived in the margins, forced to learn silence and invisibility, as if they were virtues. Even the photographs that seemed cheerful now carried a hidden weight, the child's bowed head, the shadows around her tiny form, the careful positioning at the edge of the frame. Each detail spoke of isolation and fear. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. The letters were more than historical documents. They were echoes of a life hidden in plain sight. Someone had meticulously documented her erasure, perhaps to remind themselves that she must remain forgotten. And yet, in leaving these traces, they had failed. Daniel now held the proof of a deliberate injustice that no one had acknowledged before. He leaned back, the lamp casting trembling shadows over the documents. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and for a moment he thought he heard a soft, brittle laugh, a sound that seemed to come from another time, another life. It was gone almost instantly, leaving only the sense of being watched, of being guided toward a truth that demanded to be uncovered. Daniel understood then that the journey into the child's story was just beginning. The letters had opened a door, and he could already feel the darkness waiting beyond it, the secrets that would challenge everything he thought he knew about wealth, family, and human cruelty. Next, we discover the harsh conditions the child endured and the first hints of the family member who ensured her silence, revealing a darkness no one could have imagined. Chapter 7. A Forgotten Name. Daniel Harper spent the next morning immersed in city archives, the air in the room thick with dust and the smell of aged paper. He pored over birth records, baptism logs, and school registries, searching for any trace of the youngest Worthington child. The older children appeared in abundance, announcements in society pages, boarding school records, even the occasional society scandal. But for the youngest, there was almost nothing. No baptism, no school enrollment, no mention at all. She had been erased. Hours passed, each record only deepening the mystery. Then, in a ledger tucked behind others, Daniel discovered a barely legible entry, a small, cramped script that seemed almost like a footnote. A child's name, only partially readable, matched nothing else in any official record. Her existence had been reduced to a faint, nearly invisible scrawl. Daniel's heart tightened. This was more than neglect. It was deliberate, orchestrated erasure. He traced the name across other sources: orphanage logs, temporary guardianship records, and private home registries. Each trail led to dead ends. The child had vanished, deliberately removed from public record, hidden behind the veneer of wealth and respectability. Daniel felt a chill at the thought of the family's influence, capable of bending institutions and controlling the narrative of their own history. Returning to the photographs spread across his table, he examined the youngest child again. Her bowed head, the shadows on her tiny face, the threadbare dress, and oversized shoes, they were evidence of an existence carefully confined and controlled. Daniel realized that her life had been dictated by someone within the household, someone determined that she remain unseen, unheard, and unremembered. The realization struck him with a weight he could hardly bear. This was not simply the story of a hidden child. It was the story of a family willing to sacrifice one of its own for the sake of image, reputation, and power. Each letter, ledger, and photograph was a piece of the puzzle, revealing a cruel design that had remained untouched for decades. Daniel traced the faint ink of her name once more, as if by repeating it aloud he could summon the child's presence. The apartment grew quiet, the faint hum of the city outside fading into silence. For the first time he imagined the child's life, the small, dim rooms where she had spent her days, the careful instructions to remain invisible, the punishment for daring to attract attention. Every element of her life had been orchestrated to erase her. He realized that understanding the person who had enforced this silence would be key to unraveling the rest of the story. Someone in the Worthington household had been responsible, wielding wealth and authority as weapons against the child. The ledger entry, faint as it was, had opened a door to secrets that demanded to be uncovered. Daniel leaned back in his chair, shivering despite the warmth of the lamp. The child's story was no longer hidden, but it remained incomplete. And as the shadows stretched across the walls of his apartment, he felt the weight of history pressing down, urging him to follow the trail wherever it might lead. Next we discover the identity of the family member who oversaw the child's erasure and the cruel methods used to ensure she remained invisible. Chapter 8. Ghosts of Beacon Hill. That evening, Daniel Harper returned to the Peaton mansion. the city quiet as dusk settled over Beacon Hill. The mansion, once gleaming in daylight, now seemed heavy, brooding, as if it were aware of his presence. The fading sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the grand halls. Each step Daniel took echoed like a whisper through the empty rooms, and the air carried the faint scent of old wood, dust, and something almost imperceptibly sweet, like faded perfume lingering in memory. He climbed to the third floor once more, the attic looming above him like a dark watchtower. The stairs groaned under his weight, each step a reminder of the mansion's age and secrets. He felt it again, that prickling sense of being observed. A fleeting shadow at the edge of his vision, vanishing the moment he tried to focus on it. And then he heard it. A soft, high-pitched giggle, brittle and fragile, echoing faintly down the hall. Daniel froze. The sound was childlike, yet it carried a strange, distant quality, as though it had traveled through decades to reach him. His eyes scanned the corners of the room, settling on the open attic door. Pushing it slowly, he revealed trunks and forgotten belongings covered in layers of dust. Dolls with cracked porcelain faces stared back at him, their painted eyes chipped, their smiles frozen. Faded clothes and small shoes littered the floor, eerily arranged as if someone had left them in a hurry. Among them, he recognized the tiny shoes from the photograph, the ones that had seemed so oversized for the child's feet. Daniel's breath quickened. The mansion was no longer just a building. It was a vessel of memory. Every object, every shadow, every faint whisper seemed to hold fragments of a life hidden for decades. The youngest Worthington child had existed here, trapped in rooms that were meant to erase her. The toys, the clothing, even the shadows seemed to testify to her presence, as if the mansion itself had been forced to remember what her family wanted, forgotten. He knelt beside a small trunk tucked into a dark corner, lifting the lid to reveal old letters, diaries, and more photographs. The items were fragile, delicate, yet they pulsed with the weight of untold stories. The child's life had been one of silence, secrecy, and forced invisibility. Her siblings had been celebrated, her parents' wealth flaunted, while she had been relegated to shadows. And yet here, the mansion had preserved her presence, defying the family's intent. A sudden draft rattled the windows, and Daniel felt a chill race down his spine. It was as though the house itself were warning him, reminding him that some secrets were dangerous, even to the most careful investigator. And still, he could not turn away. The child's story demanded to be told, and he had no choice but to follow it into the darkness she had endured. Next we discover the identity of the family member who orchestrated the child's confinement, and the first glimpses of the cruel mechanisms used to keep her invisible to the world. Chapter 9. The Keeper of Secrets. Daniel Harper returned to his apartment, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and rain from the streets below. The mansion's attic, with its cracked dolls and tiny shoes, had left him unsettled, yet the questions swirling in his mind demanded answers. Who in the Worthington household had enforced the child's silence? Who had ensured she remained invisible even in the midst of family life? The answer came unexpectedly. An old archivist, Mrs. Lillian Crane, had once worked for the Peaton estate and had quietly arranged for some of the Worthington papers to be preserved. Daniel had tracked her down, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a voice that trembled just slightly with age. She greeted him cautiously, her hands folded neatly over her lap. "You're looking for the child?" she said immediately, as if she had been expecting him. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "Yes," he admitted. "I believe someone deliberately erased her existence, but I need to know who and why." Mrs. Crane's eyes darkened. "Some truths are dangerous," she murmured, "but since you found the photograph, you deserve to know. It was the mother, Mrs. Worthington herself. She was the keeper of secrets, the one who ensured the child never appeared in public, never spoke freely, never left the rooms she commanded her to inhabit. Every letter, every order, every diary note you found, it was her hand, guiding the erasure." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected a family member, but the weight of such calculated cruelty was overwhelming. Mrs. Worthington's obsession with perfection and social standing had transformed the youngest child into something the world was forbidden to see. The diaries, the letters, the faded photograph, all were instruments of a mother's relentless control. Mrs. Crane continued, her voice low and trembling. She used the mansion itself as part of the punishment. Rooms were locked, corridors blocked, and servants were instructed to ignore her entirely. It was as if she wanted the child to vanish even while breathing the same air. The family complied, fearful of her temper and her influence over the household's fortune. Only a few servants knew, and they dared not speak. Daniel absorbed the information, each word settling like a stone in his chest. The child had lived in isolation, her life dictated by fear and invisibility. Her suffering had been deliberate, intentional, a private horror cloaked behind wealth and propriety. He left Mrs. Crane's home with a heavy sense of purpose. The photographs and letters he carried were no longer just historical artifacts. They were evidence of a carefully orchestrated cruelty preserved through decades of silence. The mansion, the objects, and the faded pages had all borne witness to a child forced to exist in shadows, remembered only by those brave, or foolish, enough to acknowledge her. Daniel knew the next steps would be difficult. The mother's influence had extended far beyond the walls of the mansion, and uncovering more of the truth would require him to follow the threads of secrecy wherever they led. Next we discover the mechanisms of control Mrs. Worthington used and the hidden rooms in the mansion where the child was confined, places no outsider had ever entered.
Did you know? In the United States during the 1800s, there was no formal legal system to protect children from abuse by adults, even within families. It wasn't until the case of an 8-year-old girl named Mary Ellen Wilson that child cruelty became a matter of public law enforcement. Mary Ellen was severely abused by her foster parents in New York City in 1874, and when concerned neighbors sought help, they found there were no laws specifically to protect children from such treatment. To secure her rescue, advocates first had to use animal cruelty statutes because no child protection statutes existed. The attention this case received led directly to the creation of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the first child welfare agency in the United States, a major turning point in social history. This shows that even when the innocent suffered in plain sight, society lacked systems to intervene, a stark reality that mirrors the hidden suffering theme in your story.
Chapter 10. The Locked Rooms. Daniel Harper returned to the Peaton mansion, the evening sky already bleeding into shades of grey over Beacon Hill. The wind whistled through broken windows, carrying the faint scent of rain and decay. He paused at the grand front doors, feeling a strange weight pressing on his chest, as if the house itself were aware of his intrusion. He had learned much from Mrs. Crane, but now he needed to see the spaces where the youngest Worthington child had lived, rooms no visitor had ever been allowed to enter. The servants' quarters on the 3rd floor were a labyrinth of narrow halls and hidden doors. Daniel moved slowly, listening to the groan of the floorboards beneath him. Dust motes swirled in the lamplight, creating tiny ghostly specks in the shadows. At the far end of the hall, partially concealed by a false panel, he found a small door with a rusty lock. He knelt, examining the mechanism, and realized that this had once been used to confine someone, a child, he now understood, forced to remain unseen, silent, and utterly alone. Inside, the room was tiny, barely large enough to contain a narrow bed, a small chair, and a single chest. The walls were bare, the paint peeling, and the floorboards uneven. A faint, sweet smell lingered, the ghost of perfume, or perhaps the faint memory of the child's presence. On the bed lay a small, worn dress, its fabric threadbare, shoulders patched, and the hem frayed. Beneath it, the cracked shoes from the photograph waited silently. Daniel's heart tightened as he imagined the child spending hours, perhaps days, confined within these 4 walls, invisible to the rest of her family. He explored further, uncovering another hidden room behind the servants' staircase. This space was darker, colder, and smaller still. Its only light came from a tiny high window. There were scratches on the floor, marks of wrestle, pacing, and a few scraps of paper, long forgotten, scribbled with childish attempts at escape or communication. Daniel's hands shook as he picked them up. Each mark, Each note spoke of isolation, fear, and the unbearable weight of being deliberately erased from existence. He realized that the mansion itself had been complicit, every hidden door, locked room, and neglected hallway a tool in the child's confinement. Her family had relied not only on wealth, but on architecture and secrecy to enforce control. The child had lived in shadows, her very air controlled, her life hidden behind walls designed to keep her invisible. Daniel paused, feeling a chill creep down his spine. The silence of the rooms pressed against him, almost suffocating, as if the house were breathing, waiting, and watching. Somewhere deep within, he imagined the child herself, silent, watching, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. And now, Daniel understood that he was not just witnessing history. He was walking through the remnants of cruelty and secrecy, the echoes of a childhood deliberately erased. Next, we discover the methods of psychological control Mrs. Worthington employed and the child's desperate attempts to make herself heard, despite the walls that kept her silent. Chapter 11. Whispers in the Shadows. Daniel Harper returned to his apartment with a heavy sense of anticipation, carrying with him the sketches, letters, and small items he had photographed in the hidden rooms of the Peaton mansion. Each piece told a fragment of the youngest Worthington child's life, yet the true horror lay not in what was preserved, but in what had been silenced. He spread the items across his table, the lamp casting long, trembling shadows over the worn shoes and tattered dress. As he examined the scraps of paper, he realized the child had tried to communicate. Tiny marks, childish handwriting barely visible to the untrained eye, suggested she had attempted to leave messages, pleas, or notes to anyone who might notice. Words like, "I am here," or "Please see me," were scratched into margins, hidden beneath letters or in the folds of discarded garments. Her handwriting was uneven, trembling, yet determined, a silent rebellion against the carefully constructed invisibility imposed upon her. The letters from Mrs. Worthington, interspersed among the child's own attempts at expression, revealed the calculated cruelty she endured. Instructions were precise. Do not make noise. Do not speak unless spoken to. The household must not see you. Any disobedience will be punished quietly but severely. Daniel traced the lines with his finger, the weight of the mother's control pressing down even from a century away. Every object, every scrap of paper, every shadow in the attic told the same story. Fear was a tool, and isolation its weapon. Daniel leaned back in his chair, imagining the child's daily life, the confined rooms, the lack of companionship, the strictures imposed on her movements. These had formed a world where silence was survival. The child had learned to exist in shadows, to move quietly, to erase herself even while alive. Yet despite everything, she had resisted in small ways. The marks on paper, the subtle shifts in position captured in photographs, the careful preservation of her tiny possessions. She had refused to vanish completely. A sudden chill brushed against Daniel's neck, and he looked up instinctively. The apartment was silent, yet he felt an undeniable presence, a reminder that the child's story was still alive in these objects, these shadows, and these letters. The mansion, the attic, and the carefully hidden rooms were witnesses to her suffering, and now he was too. The weight of understanding pressed down on him. To tell her story would mean exposing the dark methods of control Mrs. Worthington had employed, revealing the invisible chains that had confined her. Daniel knew this was no longer simply about history. It was about honoring a life erased, giving voice to someone who had been silenced for the sake of wealth and reputation. As he gathered the letters and sketches, he realized the child's silent rebellion had left a trail, a delicate, fragile thread he could follow, and he would. Every mark, every shadow, every object whispered the same thing. She had existed. She had suffered, and she deserved to be remembered. Next we discover the cruel punishments used to enforce her silence, and the ways the Worthington household manipulated fear to keep her trapped in a life unseen. Chapter 12. The Tools of Control. Daniel Harper returned to the apartment, the city outside cloaked in a cold, early evening fog. He placed the Worthington photograph in the center of the table, surrounded by letters, diaries, and the tiny shoes he had uncovered. His mind replayed Mrs. Crane's words about the mother, the keeper of secrets, the orchestrator of the child's invisibility. But Daniel needed more than words. He needed proof of how the child had been controlled, confined, and silenced. He turned to a bundle of letters he had carefully preserved from the attic. One in particular, addressed in precise, authoritative handwriting, detailed instructions for the household staff. She must not speak to anyone. Meals are to be served in silence. Do not acknowledge her presence unless necessary. Any deviation from this protocol will be met with quiet but firm reprimand. The words were clinical, almost sterile, yet beneath them lay a chilling cruelty. The family had weaponized obedience and fear to maintain their illusion of perfection. Daniel spread the pages on the table, tracing the details of punishments outlined within. One note described a child kept in a small, dimly lit room for hours, sometimes days, her toys removed, her movements restricted. Another recounted instances where she was ignored at meals, forced to eat in solitude, while her siblings celebrated birthdays or holidays in bright, cheerful dining rooms. These were not mere disciplinary measures, they were calculated techniques to erase her presence and identity. As he examined the letters further, Daniel noticed subtle references to the child's clothing and appearance. Dress patched and worn, shoes oversized, keep her appearance modest, unremarkable, unnoticed, one entry read. Every aspect of her life had been meticulously controlled: what she wore, where she moved, what she touched, and even how she looked in the world. Daniel felt a cold dread settle over him. This was not accidental neglect. It was a deliberate, structured campaign of erasure, implemented with precision and authority. He leaned back in his chair, imagining the child pacing the dim rooms of the mansion, her tiny hands clutching a doll with chipped porcelain, her eyes avoiding the gaze of servants, siblings, and parents alike. The weight of enforced invisibility must have been suffocating, a constant reminder that she existed only as the family allowed. And yet, despite it all, she had left traces. Small marks, messages hidden in folds of paper, subtle defiance in photographs. She had refused to vanish entirely. Daniel picked up the photograph again, studying the smallest child. The shadows, the bowed head, the threadbare dress, it was all a silent testament to the cruelty she endured. Every letter, every note, every hidden object confirmed that the Worthington family had wielded fear as a weapon, and the mansion itself had become an accomplice in her confinement. The historian felt the magnitude of the story pressing upon him. He was no longer just uncovering history. He was bearing witness to a life meticulously erased and cruelly controlled, and the darkness of the child's confinement was only beginning to reveal itself. Next we discover the child's rare moments of quiet resistance and the subtle ways she fought to assert her presence despite a household designed to make her invisible. Chapter 13. Quiet Rebellion. Daniel Harper sat in his apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of a life long hidden: letters, tattered clothing, tiny shoes, and the haunting photograph of the youngest Worthington child. The shadows from his desk lamp stretched across the room, but he barely noticed them. His mind was consumed by the fragments of a child's life, by the glimpses of defiance she had quietly woven into her existence, despite the strict control of Mrs. Worthington. He picked up a faded piece of paper, nearly invisible beneath a stack of letters. The child had scratched something along the margin in uneven handwriting. "I saw the sun today." Daniel's eyes widened. The message was small, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. Amid the oppressive rules, the locked rooms, and the relentless surveillance, she had found moments to assert her own existence, to record her presence, even if no one would see it. Other letters, previously overlooked, revealed similar acts of subtle rebellion. A torn page from a diary hinted that she had rearranged a doll collection overnight, positioning the figures in ways that symbolized freedom or escape. A small fabric scrap, carefully folded and hidden beneath her bed, suggested she had been practicing stitches and patterns, small acts of creation in an environment designed to erase her. Daniel felt the weight of these tiny resistances. They were courageous, delicate, and profoundly human. He imagined the child pacing her dimly lit room, her eyes avoiding the gaze of her mother and siblings, yet noticing every detail in the shadows. She had learned to move silently, to whisper to herself, to leave traces in small ways that no adult would detect. Each act, no matter how minor, was a defiance against invisibility, a refusal to be completely erased from existence. The historian traced the marks of her resistance in the photog. Rough. Even the way she held herself, slightly apart, head bowed but not entirely defeated, spoke of a subtle strength. She had endured isolation and control, yet her spirit had persisted in these almost imperceptible ways. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. The child's quiet rebellion had survived time, leaving traces that now guided him. He leaned back, thinking of the mansion itself. The hidden rooms, the locked doors, the silent servants, all had been instruments of control. Yet the child had used the very constraints imposed upon her to resist. Her tiny rebellions were like whispers carried through the walls, hidden from sight but impossible to completely destroy. The mansion may have held her captive, but her spirit remained alive within it, leaving evidence for anyone determined enough to uncover it. Daniel realized then that the story was no longer just about cruelty. It was about survival. Even in the face of deliberate erasure, she had found a way to assert herself, to leave a mark that would endure long after the family thought she had vanished. The historian's role was clear: to piece together these fragments, to illuminate a life that had been intentionally hidden, and to give voice to a child whose quiet rebellion had been her only defense. Next, we discover the moments when the child's resistance was nearly discovered and the escalating danger she faced from those determined to enforce her invisibility. Chapter 14. Close Calls. Daniel Harper leaned over the scattered letters on his apartment table, the dim lamp casting trembling shadows over the artifacts of the youngest Worthington child's hidden life. Her quiet acts of rebellion had become increasingly apparent to him: the notes hidden in folds of clothing, the rearranged dolls, the faint marks on paper. But with each revelation, Daniel sensed a rising tension, a creeping awareness of the danger she must have faced in her daily life. The letters revealed incidents that made his stomach tighten. One entry described her nearly being caught while trying to play in a small sunlit alcove, a rare escape from the suffocating gloom of her locked rooms. A servant had glanced toward the doorway, and the child had flattened herself against the wall, silent and invisible, holding her breath until the threat passed. Another letter recounted a meal where she had dared to speak a word, only to be met with a sharp look from Mrs. Worthington. Her punishment was swift: isolation for the remainder of the day, her meals brought silently to her quarters. Each misstep was met with consequences, and yet she persisted, subtly, courageously, with acts of defiance that left traces for Daniel to discover decades later. Daniel imagined the fear she must have lived with. Every shadow, every footstep, every creak of the mansion's floorboards could signal danger. The house, designed for grandeur, had become a cage. Every corner held a potential threat. Every servant and sibling a silent enforcer of Mrs. Worthington's cruel rules. And still, the child had found ways to assert herself, leaving traces of life in the very spaces meant to erase her. He studied a photograph again, the young girl seated slightly apart, her head bowed, her threadbare dress and oversized shoes marking her as different. Yet there was something in her posture, something so subtle, a hint of determination, a flicker of awareness that spoke to her enduring spirit. Even in fear, she had resisted invisibility. A small note in a diary caught Daniel's attention, describing a near discovery. "I was nearly seen today. Mother's shadow passed too close. My heart raced, but I remained still. She cannot know." He shivered at the words. The child's life had been a constant balance of presence and concealment, daring to exist while avoiding detection. Each day had been a delicate performance of invisibility, her survival dependent on silence and careful observation. Daniel realized the mansion itself had been an accomplice, every locked room, every hidden passage a tool of control. And yet, within that confinement, the child had carved small pockets of resistance, silent acts of rebellion that left faint fingerprints on history. Her story was a fragile testament to courage under oppression, a reminder that even in isolation, the human spirit finds ways to endure. As he gathered the letters and photographs, Daniel felt the weight of her struggle pressing on him. He knew the next discoveries would reveal even deeper horrors, the psychological manipulations, the punishments, and the relentless control Mrs. Worthington had wielded to enforce invisibility. Next, we discover the cruel rituals of discipline, the subtle manipulations that kept the child obedient, and the moments that broke her spirit while forging her quiet resilience. Chapter 15. The Discipline of Silence. Daniel Harper returned to his apartment with a sense of grim anticipation. The mansion, the letters, and the hidden rooms had revealed much, but now he needed to understand the extent of the psychological control Mrs. Worthington had exercised over the youngest child. The documents he had gathered were more than evidence. They were a map of suffering and silent endurance. He carefully opened a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was precise and measured, yet the content was chilling. Mrs. Worthington had detailed instructions for keeping the child compliant. Do not acknowledge her presence in company. Correct any behavior quietly but firmly. Deny her requests for attention. She must understand invisibility is her duty. Each letter read like a manual of manipulation, combining fear, isolation, and subtle threats to mold the child into silence. Daniel's chest tightened as he read on. Another note described a form of punishment almost surgical in its cruelty. The child was confined to a tiny, dimly lit room for hours, sometimes days, with only minimal food and no interaction. Her clothing would be patched and worn, her shoes oversized, marking her as different even in the smallest details. She was denied the warmth of family life, forbidden from joining her siblings, and carefully monitored by the household staff. Every movement, every breath, every small act of rebellion was noted and corrected. Yet among the records, Daniel found traces of the child's resilience. She had adapted, learning to navigate fear, to endure punishment, to exist in silence without losing herself entirely. Notes hidden in clothing folds, marks on discarded paper, and subtle changes in her posture in photographs all spoke to a quiet strength, a determination to persist despite her circumstances. Daniel felt a mixture of awe and this child had survived an invisible war waged against her by her own family. He leaned back in his chair, imagining the daily reality of her life, waking in the confined room, pacing in the shadows, speaking only when absolutely necessary, every word measured, every action calculated. Her world was one of constant surveillance and relentless psychological control, and yet she had found ways to assert her presence, leaving faint signs of her existence for those patient enough to find them. Daniel realized that Mrs. Worthington's methods were more than discipline. They were instruments of erasure, tools designed to shape not just behavior, but identity itself. The child's very sense of self had been threatened, forced to shrink to fit the boundaries imposed by a mother obsessed with appearances and control. But even in the darkness, the child's spirit endured. Her subtle acts of resistance, the notes, the hidden objects, the quiet defiance, were a testament to the resilience of life, even when confined and suppressed. Daniel understood that his task was not only to uncover the cruelty, but to illuminate the courage that had survived it. Next we discover the child's rare moments of comfort and connection, the fleeting glimpses of freedom, and the fragile bonds she formed within the walls meant to erase her. Chapter 16. Fleeting moments. Daniel Harper sat quietly in his apartment, surrounded by the remnants of the youngest Worthington child's hidden life. The letters, scraps of paper, and photographs had revealed cruelty and confinement, but now he sought the rare glimpses of comfort and humanity that had punctuated her existence. Even in the oppressive shadow of Mrs. Worthington's control, there had been moments of light, tiny, fragile, and easily overlooked. Among the papers was a letter from a distant aunt, one of the few family members who had shown any kindness. She described visiting the mansion briefly, bringing a small doll and a ribbon for the child's hair. She smiled, the aunt wrote, though briefly. Her eyes, so guarded, revealed a longing for attention, for warmth, for a touch that says she exists. Daniel's heart ached. These fleeting moments of connection were like sparks in darkness, ephemeral yet powerful, proof that the child's spirit had not been entirely extinguished. In another corner of the attic, Daniel found a small chest containing toys that had been smuggled in by a sympathetic servant. There were tiny carved animals, pieces of cloth fashioned into dolls, and a few books with pages worn from repeated handling. Each item spoke of quiet rebellion, a small defiance against a household intent on erasing her presence. She had treasured these objects, arranging them carefully, creating a private world of comfort within the confines of her enforced isolation. The photographs, too, revealed moments of subtle joy. In one image, the child's posture was slightly less rigid, a faint curve of a smile visible beneath her bowed head. She had posed for the camera in silence, yet her small defiance, the tilt of her shoulders, the careful placement of a hand, spoke volumes. Even within the strictures imposed by her mother, she had found ways to assert her humanity. Daniel traced his finger over the letters and objects, imagining the courage required for these fleeting moments of freedom. Each small act, a stolen glance, a whispered thought, a hidden toy, was a form of survival, a way for her to maintain a sense of self when every part of her life had been regimented and controlled. The mansion, designed as a cage, had inadvertently preserved evidence of her resilience. He paused, reflecting on the stark contrast between these fragile glimpses of joy and the harsh reality of her daily existence. The locked rooms, the isolation, the constant surveillance, all had sought to erase her. Yet she had persisted, leaving behind traces of life and courage, evidence that even the most oppressive systems cannot completely extinguish the human spirit. Daniel knew that these moments, small and easily overlooked, were crucial to understanding the child's story. They were proof that within the darkness, light can persist. And as he organized the letters and photographs, he felt a growing responsibility to honor not only her suffering, but also her quiet triumphs, however fleeting they had been. Next we discover the final secrets of the mansion and the shocking evidence that the child's story extended beyond what even Daniel had imagined, revealing the ultimate cost of her invisibility. Chapter 17. The Mansion's Last Secrets. Daniel Harper returned to the Peton mansion one final time, the evening fog curling around the stately facade of Beacon Hill. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and lingering history. He knew he was approaching the final pieces of the child's story, the hidden truths the mansion had guarded for decades. Each step through the empty halls felt like stepping deeper into a memory, the shadows stretching like silent witnesses. The third-floor attic revealed more than he had imagined. Behind a false wall panel, he discovered a narrow compartment, carefully concealed. Inside were bundles of letters, small belongings, and a diary. The diary's pages were yellowed and brittle, yet the handwriting was precise, deliberate, and filled with both fear and longing. Daniel traced the words, each sentence a window into a life shaped by both oppression and subtle defiance. One entry described the child's realization that the world outside the mansion existed without her. They laugh, they play. I am not there. I am only the shadow they walk past. Yet I am here. I exist. The power of the words struck Daniel. They were more than reflections. They were declarations of existence, a quiet refusal to vanish entirely despite years of invisibility. Among the belongings, Daniel found evidence of a life lived in miniature acts of rebellion, tiny embroidered handkerchiefs, folded carefully and hidden, a small carved figure tucked into the corner of a trunk, and a threadbare journal meticulously maintained despite the fear of discovery. Each object carried her presence forward, leaving traces of a life forced into shadow. Yet the diary also revealed the mansion's ultimate cruelty. Mrs. Worthington had installed secret observation points hidden behind panels and doors to monitor the child's every movement. Punishments were not always visible, so sometimes isolation, sometimes removal of possessions, sometimes simple, silent disapproval. But each act reinforced the lesson that she was not permitted to exist fully. The mansion itself had been weaponized, a space constructed to maintain invisibility while documenting compliance. Daniel paused, holding a small shoe in his hand. The weight of history pressed upon him. The mansion had preserved these artifacts, but it had also preserved the trauma, the silent suffering that the child had endured. Her quiet courage, hidden resistance, and fleeting moments of joy were all trapped within these walls. And now, after more than a century, they were coming to light. He realized the ultimate cost of her invisibility, a life denied companionship, freedom, and recognition. Yet despite it, she had left a record, a legacy of survival hidden in shadows, preserved by the very walls designed to erase her. Daniel understood then that his work was no longer academic. It was an act of justice, a chance to honor a life deliberately silenced and to ensure that the child's story would finally be told. Next we discover the final chapter of her life and the aftermath of her erasure, as Daniel pieces together how her existence shaped the hidden corners of the Worthington legacy and the haunting impact of a childhood unseen. Chapter 18. The Echoes That Remain. Daniel Harper sat in his apartment, surrounded by the carefully preserved remnants of the youngest Worthington child's life. Letters, photographs, diaries, and the tiny shoes all told a story of deliberate invisibility, silent rebellion, and quiet courage. But now, he faced the task of piecing together the final truths, the aftermath of a life hidden, the legacy of erasure, and the echoes that remained long after the mansion's doors had closed. The final diary entries offered a glimpse into the child's later years. She had grown into adolescence within the confines of carefully controlled spaces, her world still bounded by the shadow of Mrs. Worthington's rules. Yet, there were signs of resilience and adaptation. She learned to read, to write, and to find solace in small creations. A miniature quilt, a hand-carved figure, a journal kept hidden beneath a floorboard. These were her victories, small and private, against a life designed to erase her. Daniel noted a turning point in the diaries. A faint hope appeared when a distant relative, unaware of Mrs. Worthington's strict control, took an interest in the child's education. Lessons were arranged in secret, brief but meaningful escapes from isolation. The child learned that the world outside the mansion existed, and that she, too, had a place within it. Yet even this relief was fragile, constantly threatened by the mother's vigilance and the oppressive atmosphere of the household. The letters revealed that after Mrs. Worthington's death, the child finally gained a measure of independence. Freed from the mansion's surveillance and the suffocating authority, she lived quietly, her existence acknowledged only by a few distant relatives and the occasional friend. She had survived, scarred, cautious, and shaped by years of enforced invisibility, but she had endured. Daniel felt a profound respect for her resilience. Her life, though hidden for decades, had not been broken. He leaned back and surveyed the table. The photographs, letters, and diaries were no longer mere artifacts. They were witnesses to survival, courage, and the enduring human spirit. Every shadow in the mansion, every locked door, every hidden room had once sought to erase her. Yet she had left traces, whispers of defiance, and a testament to quiet perseverance that transcended time. Daniel understood the weight of his responsibility. The child's story, silenced for over a century, would now be shared. Her struggle, her small victories, and the cruelty she endured were not merely history. They were a reminder that invisibility can never fully erase a life that refuses to vanish. As he carefully catalogued the final letters, Daniel felt a connection across time. The child's presence lingered in the artifacts, in the shadows of the mansion, and now, in his hands. He realized that some stories, no matter how hidden, demand to be heard. And this one, born of silence, fear, and quiet courage, would finally echo into the world, the end.